The Supreme Court has dealt a significant blow to the Trump administration, blocking the president from deploying the National Guard to Chicago. In the 6-3 ruling, the court's 3 liberal justices were joined by Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, and Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And today's decision could jeopardize Guard deployments in other cities. With us now, CNN senior legal analyst Ellie Holding is a former federal prosecutor. Walk us through the reasoning here from the Supreme Court, which I have to say is truly interesting.
It really is. It's an unusual decision and a major setback for the Trump administration, not just in Chicago, but more broadly. The law that Donald Trump used to deploy the National Guard in the first place says that the president can call out the National Guard if he is unable with regular forces. We're going to come back to that, okay? Regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. Now, the Trump administration argued that means if he's unable with regular cops, with FBI, DEA, ICE, to enforce the laws, then you can call in the National Guard. What the Supreme Court said is, no. That phrase, regular forces, that means the regular military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and only those very narrow areas where the military is even allowed to come in and execute the laws.
Hey there, Jack here. So this happening right now. The United States Supreme Court just dropped a bombshell on Donald Trump. And I am not talking about some minor procedural ruling or a narrow technical decision. I am talking about 2 major cases that could fundamentally reshape presidential power in America. Cases that could strip Trump of some of his most aggressive executive tools. Cases that the highest court in the land just agreed to hear. And Trump, oh man, Trump's team is in full panic mode right now. Because the Supreme Court just said, yeah, we need to look at what you are doing. We need to decide if you have gone too far. And that alone is huge. That alone signals that even Trump's own Supreme Court appointees
in the first place. So basically, the Supreme Court has put the bar very high to deploy the National Guard in the future and has limited it to an almost minuscule slice of all conduct on the streets. It's going to make it very difficult for the president to justify the National Guard in Portland, New York, anywhere else.
Explain why this mattered in Chicago, but didn't play in Los Angeles or in Portland, Oregon, where the Guard was also deployed.
So I think you and I discussed Los Angeles and D.C. were different. D.C. was different. Trump was allowed generally to deploy there because the president is in charge of the D.C. National Guard, okay? Put that to the side. L.A. was different, Los Angeles, because there were protests that at times turned violent happening there. The rationale in Chicago is much more generalized. Just, well, crime rates are high and it's very dangerous. And the Supreme Court has said that's not enough for this specific statute.
Yeah, and again, for it to be allowed in cities like Chicago in these circumstances, it would have to get past posse comitatus, right?
Right.
Yes. Which means what?
You with your Latin phrases, which means that the military traditionally cannot conduct
might be getting uncomfortable with how far he is pushing executive authority. The court announced it is taking 2 explosive cases. 2 cases that directly challenge Trump's power grabs. The first case is about Trump firing a Democratic commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission. He just removed her from her position and said he has the authority to do it. But lower courts said, wait, hold on. You cannot just fire independent commissioners whenever you want. That is not how this works. There are protections in place, separation of powers, checks and balances. And now the Supreme Court is going to decide who is right, Trump or the lower courts. If they side against Trump, it overturns nearly a century of precedent about how independent agencies work. It fundamentally changes the balance of power between the president and the federal bureaucracy.
Regular law enforcement activities. They can't make traffic stops. They can't do searches. They can really only provide a very basic security function. So it's very, very narrow. So this decision really leaves very limited room for Trump to deploy the National Guard elsewhere. They can try to argue circumstances are different, but if the argument's just going to be, well, it's dangerous, that's not going to cut it.
Where they're not invited is also important, too.
Yes. Well, it's a big difference if the governor requests aid.
Right.
That changes the whole legal calculus. Interesting coalition here, right? We're so used to these 6-3 decisions, 6 conservatives versus 3 liberals. Here you had Chief Justice Roberts, Amy Coney Barrett, and Brett Kavanaugh joining with the liberals, leaving the 3 conservatives complaining about this. This was an emergency docket case, meaning there was not full briefing. There was no oral argument. And there's been criticism of the emergency docket. The way this plays is whoever loses hates the emergency docket.
All right. Again, very interesting reasoning. Could have a vast impact depending on where else the president wanted to deploy the Guard in the next coming months. Elione, great to see you. Have a great holiday.
All right, you too.
S.E. Cupp and Max Rose are with me. So, Max, you've had, and you've got other cities where lower courts have also ruled against the president, but this is from the Supreme Court. And this...
The second case is even wilder. Trump is trying to deploy National Guard troops in a Democratic state over the objections of the governor. He says he has the authority to federalize the National Guard and send them wherever he wants for public safety reasons. The state said absolutely not. That is unconstitutional. You cannot just deploy military forces in states against the governor's wishes unless there is an insurrection or invasion. Lower courts agreed with the state and issued injunctions blocking Trump from deploying the troops. Trump appealed to the Supreme Court and asked them to lift the injunctions and let him send the troops. And the Supreme Court said no. They refused to block the lower court rulings, which means, at least for now, Trump cannot deploy those troops. And they are going to review the whole thing and decide if a president has that kind of power.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, as Max was alluding, it's a lot of the checks and balances are finally checking and balancing, right? From the courts to House Republicans pushing back on Epstein, Senate Republicans saying no to ending the filibuster, on and on and on. And the firewall that Trump came in with, where it seemed like just a year ago, Aaron, I'm sure you remember, nothing was off the table. He had unchecked power. It looked like and felt like he was going to be able to do anything he wanted. That dam is breaking a bit. And I think politically, that's going to really frustrate him. Trump is not a guy that gets chastened when told no, or when there's pushback. He gets angry. He gets retaliatory. And so I think politically this is going to make him want to do more and find other ways around this ruling. And you have to remember that while this was a signature policy proposal and promise, the way in which Trump is going after crime and immigration is not widely popular. While fixing immigration and lowering crime in our major cities is a popular idea, it's partly why he won. The way he's been doing it has not been popular, even among a lot of folks in his own base.
Can you believe this? This is the Supreme Court, a court that includes 3 Trump appointees telling Trump to pump the brakes, telling him he might have gone too far, telling him there are limits to presidential power. And that is significant, really significant, because Trump's entire second-term strategy has been based on maximizing executive authority, on pushing boundaries, on testing how much power he can consolidate. And now the Supreme Court is stepping in to say, okay, let us examine that. Let us figure out if what you are doing is actually constitutional. And that examination alone is dangerous for Trump because it creates uncertainty. It limits his ability to act. It emboldens opposition. It sends a signal to lower courts that they can push back too. A liberal justice wrote a scathing statement. She called Trump's actions a dangerous disregard for constitutional limits. She said no president is above the law. And while that justice is a liberal, the fact that the court as a whole agreed to take these cases means conservative justices are interested too. They want to weigh in. They want to set precedent. And that should terrify Trump, because if the court rules against him on either of these cases, it strips him of major tools. The ability to fire independent commissioners, gone. The ability to deploy National Guard troops wherever he wants, gone. Those are huge losses. They fundamentally change how much power Trump has. Legal experts are going wild over this. A prominent Supreme Court litigator told a major newspaper that this term will force the court to decide whether they are actually going to say no to Donald Trump on anything. And that is the question, right? We have a conservative supermajority, 3 justices appointed by Trump himself. But does that mean they are going to rubber stamp everything he does? Or are they actually going to apply the law, actually going to enforce constitutional limits? We are about to find out. Because these cases are not abstract. They are not theoretical. They are about real actions Trump is taking right now, and the court is going to have to rule, going to have to pick a side. The timing on this is also incredible because it is happening right as massive protests are flooding the streets, right as millions of Americans are marching against Trump's authoritarian tendencies, right as the opposition party is rolling out its reform and resist strategy, right as Trump's approval rating is cratering. It is like the entire system is pushing back at once. The people, the opposition party, the states, and now the judiciary. All of them saying this is too much. This has gone too far. We need to check this power. And Trump is caught in the middle of it all, trying to fight on every front and losing ground. So yes, this is a big deal. This is the kind of thing that could define Trump's second term, could limit what he is able to accomplish, could embolden his opponents, could reshape the balance of power in American government. The Supreme Court just threw down a gauntlet, and Trump is going to have to respond. And however he responds, whatever happens with these cases, it is going to have massive implications for the rest of his presidency. Let me break down these two cases in detail because there is a lot of legal complexity here, but it matters. It really matters. The first case is about a Democratic commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. The FTC is what is called an independent agency, which means it is supposed to operate independently from direct presidential control. That independence is protected by statute, by law. Commissioners serve fixed terms. They can only be removed for cause, meaning you cannot just fire them because you disagree with their politics or their decisions. You need an actual reason. Misconduct, neglect of duty, something serious. Trump did not care about any of that. He just fired her, said she was obstructing his economic agenda, said she was too aggressive in regulating businesses, said he needed someone more aligned with his vision, and he removed her just like that. No formal cause, no process, just executive action. When she sued, when she challenged the firing in court, Trump's lawyers made a bold argument. They said the president has inherent constitutional authority to remove any executive branch official at any time for any reason. That the independent protections for agencies like the FTC are unconstitutional. That they violate the separation of powers. That all executive power belongs to the president and he can exercise it however he wants. This is a radical legal theory. It is called the unitary executive theory, and it has been around for a while. Conservative legal scholars have pushed it for decades. The idea is that the Constitution vests all executive power in the president. And if all executive power is vested in the president, then he must have complete control over everyone in the executive branch. He must be able to hire and fire at will. He must be able to direct their actions. Anything less, the theory goes, violates the Constitution. It splits executive power in unconstitutional ways. But here is the problem. We have had independent agencies for almost a century. The FTC was created more than 100 years ago. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, was created about 90 years ago. The NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, was created about 90 years ago. All of them designed to be independent, to operate free from direct presidential control. And the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld that independence, said it is constitutional, said Congress has the power to create agencies with this kind of structure. So if Trump wins this case, if the court accepts his unitary executive argument, it is a seismic shift. The entire structure of independent agencies collapses. Every commissioner at every independent agency becomes fireable at will by the president. The Federal Reserve, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Federal Communications Commission, all of them suddenly vulnerable to direct presidential control. Suddenly, the president can fire commissioners whenever he wants, can direct their decisions, can turn independent watchdogs into partisan enforcers. That is why this case is so huge. It is not just about one commissioner. It is about the structure of the federal government, about whether we have independent institutions or whether everything flows through the president. Trump is pushing hard for the latter. He wants maximum control. He wants to eliminate any bureaucratic resistance. He wants every agency answering directly to him. And if the Supreme Court gives him that power, if they rule in his favor, it fundamentally reshapes American governance. It creates what critics are calling an imperial presidency, a presidency with almost no institutional checks. Now let me talk about the National Guard case. This one is even more concerning. Trump has been trying to deploy National Guard troops in a Democratic state, specifically in its largest city. He says crime is out of control, that the Democratic mayor and governor are not doing their jobs, that he needs to send federal forces to restore order. He is citing his authority as commander-in-chief, saying he can federalize the National Guard whenever he determines there is a public safety need. The state said, absolutely not. The governor issued a statement saying, "We do not want your troops. We do not need your troops. This is a violation of state sovereignty. You cannot just deploy military forces in our state without our consent." The legal question here is complicated. The president does have authority to federalize the National Guard under certain circumstances. A law called the Insurrection Act, for example, allows the president to deploy military forces to suppress insurrection or enforce federal law when states cannot or will not. But that law has specific requirements. There has to be an actual insurrection or unlawful obstruction of federal law, or a state requesting assistance. None of those conditions exist in this state. There is crime, sure, every big city has crime, but there is no insurrection, no rebellion. The state is not requesting help. In fact, the state is actively opposing deployment. So Trump's lawyers are making a different argument. They are saying the president has inherent authority as commander-in-chief to deploy forces wherever he determines there is a threat to public safety, that he does not need the Insurrection Act, that his constitutional role gives him broad discretion. Lower courts said no, that is not how this works. You cannot just deploy military forces domestically whenever you feel like it. That is what separates democracies from military dictatorships. Civilian control over the military, restrictions on domestic deployment. The whole system is designed to prevent presidents from using troops as a political tool. The Supreme Court, at least temporarily, agreed with the lower courts. They refused to lift the injunctions, which means Trump cannot deploy those troops while the case is pending. That is significant because it means the court is taking the constitutional concerns seriously. They are not just automatically siding with Trump. They are actually examining whether this power grab is legal. The fact that they are reviewing it at all suggests they think there are real questions here, real issues with what Trump is trying to do. The liberal justice's statement was brutal. She did not hold back. She said the administration is showing a dangerous disregard for constitutional limits. She warned that allowing this kind of deployment would set a terrifying precedent, would give future presidents the ability to use military force against domestic political opponents, against protesters, against states that disagree with them. She invoked the principle that no president is above the law, and while she is in the minority ideologically on the court, her words carry weight. They frame the issue. They put pressure on the conservative justices to take the constitutional question seriously. The court has scheduled oral arguments for the first case in less than 2 months, which is fast for the Supreme Court. Usually cases take longer to get argued. The fact that they are moving quickly suggests they understand the urgency, understand that this is affecting governance right now. A decision could come as early as spring, right before the midterm election season heats up. That means the political implications are massive. If the court rules against Trump, it energizes the opposition. It validates their reform and resist strategy. It proves that institutional checks on Trump's power still work. But if the court rules for Trump, if they give him these expanded powers, it is a green light for even more aggressive executive action. It tells Trump he can push even harder, go even further. Let me break down what all of this means and why it matters so much. Because we are not just talking about legal technicalities here. We are talking about the fundamental structure of American government, about how much power the president should have, about what kind of country we want to be. First, the Supreme Court just put Trump on notice. By agreeing to hear these cases, by refusing to immediately side with him on the National Guard deployment, the court is sending a message. That message is, we are watching. We are going to examine what you are doing. We are going to enforce limits. That alone is significant because Trump's entire strategy has been based on the assumption that he can push boundaries without consequence. That the Supreme Court, with 3 of his own appointees, will back him up. But now there is doubt. Now there is uncertainty. And that changes Trump's calculations. He fired that commissioner thinking it would stick, thinking no court would overturn it. He tried to deploy troops, thinking the Supreme Court would let him. And now both of those assumptions are being challenged. He has to defend his actions in court, make legal arguments, convince justices who might not be convinced. While all that is happening, he cannot take similar actions elsewhere. He cannot fire other independent commissioners. He cannot deploy troops in other Democratic states, because if he does, he faces the same legal challenges, the same uncertainty. So even before any final ruling, just by taking these cases, the court has limited Trump's ability to act, has created a chilling effect on his executive overreach. The unitary executive theory is finally getting a real test. For decades, conservative legal scholars have pushed this theory, but it has never been fully litigated at the Supreme Court, never been definitively settled. Now it will be. The court is going to rule on whether the president has unlimited removal power over executive branch officials. Whatever they decide sets precedent for generations. If they say yes, if they embrace the unitary executive theory, it fundamentally changes how the federal government works. Independent agencies lose their independence. Everything becomes subject to direct presidential control. Regulatory agencies become political tools. The Federal Reserve could be pressured on interest rates, the FTC on antitrust enforcement, the SEC on securities regulation, all of it vulnerable to presidential interference. But if the court says no, if they reject the unitary executive theory, it preserves the current system, preserves the independence of these agencies, and it tells Trump and future presidents there are limits. You do not have unlimited power. You cannot just fire people because you disagree with them. You have to respect the structures Congress created. That is huge. That is a major check on presidential authority that ensures at least some parts of the federal government can operate independently, can resist political pressure, can do their jobs without fear of being fired for making the president angry. The National Guard case is about preventing military authoritarianism. And we need to be clear about that. Because what Trump is trying to do is not normal. It is not okay. Deploying military forces in a state against the governor's wishes when there is no insurrection, no rebellion, no emergency, that is authoritarian behavior. That is what dictators do. They use military force to suppress opposition, to intimidate political opponents, to control territory. American law is specifically designed to prevent that. We have strict limits on domestic military deployment precisely because the founders understood the danger of standing armies being used against civilians. If the Supreme Court lets Trump deploy troops, they are opening a door that should stay closed. They are saying any president can send military forces into any state whenever they determine there is a public safety issue. And who determines what counts as a public safety issue? The president unilaterally, without oversight, without checks. A president could say there is too much crime in this city, I am sending troops. Or, there is too much protest activity, I am sending troops. Or, this state is not enforcing laws I like, I am sending troops. It becomes a tool for political control, for federal domination of states, for military intimidation of civilians. That is terrifying. That is the kind of power that destroys democracies. The Supreme Court has to get this one right. They have to uphold the lower court injunctions. They have to say no to Trump. Because if they do not, if they give him this power, we are in uncharted and dangerous territory. We are talking about a fundamental shift in American governance, a shift toward authoritarianism, toward military rule. Once you go down that path, it is really hard to come back. These cases tie directly into the movement of people protesting against Trump's authoritarian tendencies. Millions of people just protested. They were chanting, "No kings, no dictators." They were demanding limits on presidential power. And now the Supreme Court is examining exactly that. Is Trump acting like a king? Does he have unlimited authority? Or are there constitutional constraints? The protesters in the court are asking the same questions, coming at it from different angles, but pointing at the same problem. Executive overreach, authoritarian behavior, the erosion of democratic norms. If the court rules against Trump, it validates the protesters. It says, you are right to be concerned. You are right to demand limits. The system is working. The checks and balances are holding. That energizes the movement, makes them feel heard, makes them believe that resistance matters, that organizing matters, that speaking out makes a difference. But if the court rules for Trump, if they give him these expanded powers, it tells the protesters they need to fight even harder, that the courts will not save them, that they need to win elections, flip Congress, change the political landscape. Either way, these Supreme Court cases fuel the opposition movement, either by validating their concerns or by proving that electoral action is the only solution. The political timing is critical. Oral arguments in less than 2 months. Likely decision in the spring. Right as the midterm campaigns are ramping up. Right as voters are paying attention. Right as candidates are making their pitches. If the court rules against Trump, the opposition has a massive talking point. They can say, see, even the Supreme Court says Trump went too far. Even conservative justices recognize he is violating the Constitution. Vote for us to provide more checks on his power. That is a gift to opposition campaigns. It validates everything they have been saying. It energizes their base. It persuades independents. But if the court rules for Trump, his party gets a boost. They can say the Supreme Court vindicated the president. His actions are constitutional. The other side has been lying to you about authoritarianism. It is all fake outrage. That could help candidates, could depress opposition turnout, could swing close races. So these cases are not just about legal principles. They are about political power, about who controls Congress after the upcoming elections, about whether Trump's second term is empowered or constrained. There is also the question of how Trump responds to an adverse ruling. Trump does not like losing, especially does not like being told no by courts. If the Supreme Court rules against him, does he comply? Does he respect the decision? Or does he attack the court, call them political hacks, threaten to ignore the ruling? We have seen Trump defy court orders before. We have seen him attack judges. If he does that with the Supreme Court, if he undermines their authority, it creates a constitutional crisis. It breaks the system of checks and balances because the court has no enforcement mechanism. They issue rulings, they write opinions, but they rely on the executive branch to enforce them. If the president refuses, what happens? We are in uncharted territory, in a genuine crisis of governance. Everyone is watching these cases closely. Legal scholars, political analysts, activists, foreign governments. The outcome matters, really matters. It determines what kind of presidency we have, what kind of country we are, whether we are a democracy with meaningful constraints on power, or whether we are sliding toward autocracy. The Supreme Court, willingly or not, is at the center of that determination. They are going to have to make a choice. Whatever choice they make has massive consequences. Here is the bottom line. The Supreme Court just agreed to hear 2 cases that could fundamentally limit Trump's presidential power. one about his ability to fire independent officials, one about his ability to deploy military forces domestically. Both cases challenge core elements of Trump's executive authority. Both force the court to decide how much power the president should have. The court has already signaled some skepticism by refusing to immediately side with Trump on the National Guard deployment. They are taking these constitutional questions seriously. They are going to examine whether Trump has gone too far. Depending on how they rule, it could either enable or constrain the rest of his presidency. This is happening right as millions of Americans are protesting Trump's authoritarian behavior. Right as the opposition is rolling out its resistance strategy. Right as Trump's approval is falling. The entire system seems to be pushing back against executive overreach. The people, the opposition, the states, and now potentially the courts. Trump is facing pressure from every direction. These Supreme Court cases could be the most significant institutional check yet. Could be the moment the judiciary says enough. You have pushed too far. We are drawing a line. Or it could be the moment they give Trump even more power, even more tools to dominate. We will find out soon enough. Either way, these cases are going to shape American politics for years to come.